preferences can, of course, mean almost anything. The way economists typically think about it in a conceptualized way is about the primitives of decision making, and that would, in economic terms, be time preference or aversion of risks. And the way you measure them, so the gold standard in the economics literature would be to measure them in controlled lab settings, where you give people choices and then they make decisions about different choice alternatives. For time preferences, that would be an immediate payment and higher later or delayed payment. And by varying the amount of the delayed payment, you can make the person switch from immediate to delayed, and that would give you a notion or some information about the time preference or impatience of that person, the internal rate of return that they would have to expect in order to be willing to wait. And for risk preferences, it would be a choice between, say, a lottery and a safe payment. And by varying the safe payment, you would do the same thing. You would find a point of indifference, and that would allow you to measure a person's point of indifference. And then you can start doing interpersonal comparisons using a controlled measure or with in-person comparisons. Now, what we do to reach larger populations is, of course, use survey measures that have typically been validated in this way. So first you put people into a lab setting, you give them survey items that somehow relate to time preferences or risk preferences, and then you would try to find out which of these items is a reasonably good or the best possible predictor of actually incentivized behavior in the lab. And these would be the survey items we then take to large population surveys in order to measure time preferences or risk preferences. Once you have the possibility to go to a population, you have the possibility to ask people of different ages what are their responses to questions about patience or risk preferences, and then you get measures. Now, a naive way to come at age profiles would be to just plot them. But then, of course, many things are different between people of different ages. And then it takes some statistical decomposition methods to actually decompose age from other confounders like cohort effects, period effects. And yes, and if you do that, you find some interesting patterns. So when it comes to age patterns of patients, for instance, we see that older people get less patient on average. Older people also get less willing to take risks, so more risk averse. Yeah, so what we did there was essentially, the paper you refer to is about disentangling age period and cohort effects, and also trying to find out whether there's homogeneity in the age effect, which effectively means we have a similar age profile for different cohorts, and whether this separability can be reasonably assumed or whether it contradicts the data. And once you have that mechanism or that methodology in place, you can apply that to different things. We did it for the personality measures of the so-called Big Five that are frequently used in psychology, and where there is an ongoing debate, as far as I understand, about stability or malleability of those. If we do that, first of all, we find that age effects and cohort effects are, you can decompose them. For all but one, which is neuroticism. The other ones, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, we find age profiles of the sort that they sound intuitive, but now we can actually show that, for instance, openness declines over the age range. So that is very complicated because first of all, it depends on which type of preferences, quote unquote, you look at. Because what we do is we distinguish between institutional preferences, or approval of a democratic system, approval of strong leaders, approval of a military government, and preferences for policies. And that would relate more to things like redistribution, the location on the left and right spectrum, and these type of things. And you see, for each of these dimensions, you see first different patterns, and second, you see that cohort and age profiles are not necessarily the same, which reinforces the importance to decompose them. Because just looking at a cross-section of individuals and asking them a question about approval of democracy, and then deducing from that, there is an age profile that looks like the old people prefer democracy more than the young people, would not be valid, because it would confound cohort effects with age effects. And once we decompose that, it looks indeed like older people are more in favor of democracy. But then you also see crucial differences across cohorts, and that is non-linear, interestingly. So the very young and the very old cohorts seem to have less preference for democracy, if you can say that, than the intermediate cohorts. And that might have to do with life experiences. So first of all, it basically just provides empirical evidence for something that we don't know very much about. In particular, in a time when populations are aging, that looks like a bit of an imperfect state of the world, because the usual assumption in many models of economics that are also applied for policy, for informing policymakers, would be homogeneous preferences. And now what we provide is at least a first cut of evidence regarding what's actually the distribution of preferences that are relevant for decision making in economic terms, risk and time, but also in other dimensions like political preferences. And I think it helps us to have a better understanding where we might go as the age distribution of the population shifts, which is, of course, always associated with some extrapolation error, but it's at least better than having no empirical basis. Yeah, first I think I have to be careful. So there are two ways of thinking about stability of preferences, and economists typically took preferences as exogenous, stable, and we don't think about them for good reasons. Because if we give up, in the exogeneity of preferences or the stability of preferences of sorts, then we lose a lot of the predictive power of economic models, because the models run the risk of becoming tautologies. And that's not what we're giving up. So what we try to describe is exogenous changes from the perspective of individuals in preferences that nevertheless have predictive power for decision making without being the object of the decisions that decision makers make. So we don't really give up the stability per se, we just give up, if you will, the assumption of homogeneous preferences across certain dimensions. Now, of course, we are economists, we are different from psychologists. Psychologists think differently about preferences, and they also have completely different concepts and notions. But I think in some way we are converging in terms of thinking about what life might do to people, what experiences do to preferences for risk, for delays in rewards and so on. So what we hope is that at least we start a conversation about what we learn from economics and what we learn from psychology in terms of stability of preferences or heterogeneity of preferences. So I think I should say two things. The first thing is, it's not only age, also life expectancy itself affects preferences. So what we find is that there is evidence that the expected remaining years that someone can live also shapes preferences, and that's a different concept of age that is forward-looking rather than backward-looking. And I think that's one important aspect that we bring to light, and we see that it matters for economic preferences, and here in particular for patients, not so much for risk, but we also see that it matters for political preferences for democracy. Now, what does that do? If we think about, for instance, preferences for democracy, and we found that the age profile suggests that older people are more pro-democracy, but people that expect to live longer are also more pro-democracy, then it starts getting interesting in thinking about differences across countries that have different age profiles and longevity profiles. And if you mentally compare a country with a young population that expects to not become very old to a country that is fairly old, but life expectancy is still old, then our results would say, well, the preference for democracy in the second country, in the older country, is much stronger than in the younger country. Now that imposes homogeneity of estimates across countries and so on, which I might not be able to defend too much, but still, this gives you some suggestive food for thought about what population aging might do in these countries in terms of stabilizing democracy or not. Same goes for patience. So if patience declines and if life expectancy doesn't catch up with that, if patience declines with age and life expectancy doesn't catch up too much, then that means a population that is successively aging will become more impatient, which of course might manifest itself in policy choices, in political decisions, and so on. So I think these findings have some relevance, and I think we should work more on trying to also quantitatively characterize what these implications are.